Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So if you remember, we spent last week talking about the basic elements of fiction. So fiction is our first major category of literature. After fiction, we'll cover poetry, and then after that, we'll get to drama. So we're spending 2 weeks on each category, each major type of literature. So we'll spend the first week sort of introducing it, and then we spend the second week looking at examples of that particular kind of literature. So we introduced fiction last week and we covered the basics. We talked about the elements or the characteristics that we will find in a lot of different works of fiction, things that we can look for, things that we can talk about, and obviously analyze in our own writing. When we start to perform literary analysis, we can talk about stuff like plot, characters, setting, all the things that we talked about last week, point of view, and obviously the overall theme, the overall message or meaning that we think the text is trying to communicate to us. So when we talk about fiction, as we said last week, we typically mean novels and short stories. Those are the most common types of fiction, and I gave you guys a little brief history lesson about both last week. Now, if we want to trace the origins of fiction all the way back, we can probably link them to the ancient epics, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the ancient Greeks, other ancient cultures produced these really long narrative poems, and yes, they are poems, but they tell long, sort of complicated stories involving a big cast of characters, usually a very complex, if not convoluted plot. There's, multiple settings and usually interesting themes. But a lot of those themes are similar across different cultures, different epics, different parts of the world. But a lot of those epics center around the hero's quest, some kind of a journey, like we talked about last week. So a lot of those basic elements would later show up in other types of fiction. But of course, what we have now is a lot more modern. So we talked about the rise of the novel during the 1700s, and then how the short story became pretty popular in the 1800s, largely due to the work of U.S. writers during the 19th century, and then, of course, both remain popular today. So now that we've gone over the basics, we're going to look at some specific examples of fiction here in week 3. So if you guys check out the week 3 module, you'll notice that we're looking at 4 different texts this week, 4 examples. So as I mentioned last week, due to time constraints, we're not going to be able to read an entire novel. So instead, we're just going to check out one chapter from Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, a very famous novel written during the 1860s. We're just going to get a flavor. We're just going to sort of experience it very briefly by reading the first chapter of that novel. And just with one chapter under our belts, we'll be able to see a lot of those elements that we were talking about last week. And once we get past Chapter 1 of War and Peace, we're going to look at some short stories. So the other 3 texts are all short stories, and we're going to be reading them to completion this week. So we have A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway. Very famous short story, obviously a very famous writer. Then we have Hacienda by Catherine Ann Porter, another very important American writer. And those stories are both written in the early 1930s. So they're sort of coming out at around the same time. And then finally, we move up to a more contemporary, modern text with Nilda, written by Diaz. And that came out, I believe, in 2012. I think the story might have been published a little bit earlier, but it later appeared in a short story collection put out by Diaz in 2012. And Diaz remains a pretty popular writer even today, unlike Hemingway and Tolstoy and Porter, who are obviously all dead. Diaz is still alive, and he's a pretty popular writer even today. So you guys may have heard of him, or you may have even read him. before. So that story is going to be a lot different than the others. And really, as we move through these texts, we're going to notice obvious differences in terms of subject matter, time period, obviously, settings, the backgrounds of the characters, a lot of differences. We're going to notice a lot of differences in style. Each one of these writers has a very distinctive, kind of unique style. They're all celebrated writers. Obviously, 3 of them are American. Tolstoy is Russian, or was. I mean, obviously, he's been dead for a long time. But we start with War and Peace because it's just a really famous novel. And Tolstoy, along with his fellow Russian Fyodor Dostoevsky, those 2 guys are considered to be sort of masters of the novel form. And obviously there are many Americans who have also written masterful novels who are sort of categorized in a similar way to those 2 Russian guys. I mean, going back to the 1800s when they were active, we can find, Herman Melville. Obviously he wrote Moby Dick, which might be the most famous of all American novels. We can think about John Steinbeck, sort of the first half of the 20th century. Hemingway also wrote very famous novels in addition to short stories. We can think of more recent authors like Toni Morrison, a lot of famous American novelists as well, but Tolstoy is considered one of the masters. And War and Peace is very famous. It's a very long novel, very sprawling, complex plot, a huge cast of characters. But again, we're going to be able to see a lot of the elements that we talked about last week, not only in that excerpt from the novel, but also we're going to see those same elements at work in the short stories. But as we notice, the elements are going to be working in different ways in different texts. And that's why literary analysis is fun. Because even though we're working with sort of a common vocabulary, a shared language in terms of the elements that we're looking for and what those elements mean, depending on what text we're looking at, those elements can function in all kinds of interesting, different ways. So the analysis of one text is going to look very different from the analysis of another text, because even though the same elements are going to be present, they're going to be very different in Nilda by Diaz than they are in, say, War and Peace by Tolstoy. So just to give you a little bit of background as you're reading the first chapter of War and Peace, if we're thinking about setting here, we're going back to the early 1800s. The early 19th century. We're in St. Petersburg, Russia, if we're thinking about physical location. And this is a period that's kind of important, not just in the history of Russia, but kind of in European history. This is the period of the Napoleonic Wars. So you guys probably know who Napoleon was, famous French general who essentially tried to conquer much of Europe back in this period, sort of the end of the 1700s, the very beginning of the 1800s, and a lot of other European countries banded together to fight him and defeat him. And the Russians were one of many who were fighting against Napoleon, trying to stop him from invading them and taking them over. So this is the period of those wars. So a lot of, Russian men were off fighting. So that's kind of what's going on in terms of history, and we're in St. Petersburg, which is sort of located in the western part of Russia, major, metropolitan area, big city. So basically the book is largely about several aristocratic families in Russia sort of navigating this very tumultuous time in that country's history, right? Very tumultuous in terms of the war, political situation, a lot of upheaval. So, again, we don't need to dive too far into it. We just need to have a general idea. So in chapter 1, not a whole lot happens. We basically just have an extended conversation between 2 characters, Anna Pavlovna and Prince Vasily Kuragin. I'm probably not pronouncing their names right, but it doesn't really matter. Later in the novel, we're going to meet more characters, but in this first chapter, it's just the two of them sort of sitting in Anna's house, and she's about to host a bunch of other people. They're sort of having a little social gathering, a get-together. The more technical term is salon. That's what she's hosting. Not like a place where you would go and get your hair done, but kind of similar, but it's a little bit of a different meaning. Back then, a salon referred to sort of a reception room, often just in a large house, somebody's home, but typically the home of a wealthy person, often an aristocratic person, but kind of a private setting where the hostess, in this case Anna Pavlovna, would invite other prominent members of the local society, primarily women, although men could also come. But it would primarily be a place for women of like well-born, high-ranking, wealthy families to sort of gather around, have some refreshments, talk about politics, art, culture, and, sometimes men would attend too, but it was kind of a common thing amongst the upper classes. So that's what's about to happen. They're about to have all of these guests come over. I think the prince just is like an early arrival, perhaps, and he's just there chatting with the hostess, and he's a member, Prince Kurgan, he's a member of one of these aristocratic families that we're going to be following throughout the novel. So in terms of characters, we really only meet two. But they mention other people who, if we were to read the whole novel, and it would take us a long time, but maybe one day we will, if you were to read the whole novel, you would later meet the prince's children. I think he mentions all three of his children, and they will factor into the plot later on. So this is pretty common. If you guys remember when we were talking about plots last week, I mentioned that oftentimes at the beginning of a plot, we'll get what's called the exposition, right? We'll get sort of background information. We'll get things introduced to us. The scene will kind of be set. And this is often common. I'm kind of providing exposition for you guys right now. Tolstoy wouldn't have had to explain the Napoleonic Wars and like where St. Petersburg is, because he would expect his audience back then, when this novel came out, he would obviously expect his audience to already know that stuff. But for us, sometimes we need, like when we're reading old literature from previous eras, from other countries, certainly, and we might not know as much about their history or culture, sometimes we have to do some additional background sort of research just to get started. But a lot of exposition provided by the author will come early, like in the first chapter. And sometimes it might even be delivered by characters like the prince when he's sort of introducing other characters that we're going to meet later. Oftentimes the narrator will provide exposition, just kind of setting the scene. Here's where we are. Here are these people. Here's a little bit of information about these people. Just giving the reader some basic info at the beginning of the story that the readers will obviously need in order to follow the story. So we're getting some exposition here in the first chapter. We're meeting two important characters. And if we're thinking about the point of view, like how is all of this information delivered? How is the story being told? How is it being narrated? Remember, a narrative is just a story. So in a novel or a short story, we're always going to have some kind of a narrator telling the story. And the big question for us as analyzers will be, who is the narrator? What's the narrator's deal? And what do we notice about the way the narrator is working? So here with Tolstoy, we have an omniscient third-person narrator. So you remember last week I made, or maybe 2 weeks ago, no, I think it was last week. Well, yeah, we were just talking about the basic elements of fiction, and when we were talking about point of view or the style of narration, I made the basic distinction between first person and third person. So first person is delivered by the protagonist usually. Usually the main character of the story in first person is telling the story from their perspective. I did this. That happened to me. But then we also talked about third person. And that means we have a narrator who is sort of separate from the story, a narrator that might be sort of looking down from above, kind of detached, separate, maybe somewhat more neutral in certain cases. But here we have an omniscient third person narrator. And remember, that just means that the narrator knows everything. To be omniscient is to be all-knowing or godlike. So that's the kind of narrator that we have here. An omniscient third-person narrator who kind of knows everything in this fictional world. The narrator knows about all of the characters. He can sort of introduce us to the characters. He knows what's going on in terms of the setting, in terms of all the background. And the narrator makes himself pretty present in the first chapter. He's not physically there at Anna's house, but he offers a lot of information. He offers a lot of descriptive detail, and he offers us access to a lot of different info from a lot of different points in time. He'll tell us the contents of personal letters. At times, he gives us specific information about specific characters. So this is what an omniscient third-person narrator can do. He, sort of has access to everything, and he can sort of dole out the information, sort of parcel it out to the readers over the course of the novel. So this type of point of view, this narration style, was very popular with a lot of early novels. Throughout epics also, we often get this kind of perspective. In the ancient epics, we'll see a lot of omniscient third-person narration. And then in the early novels of the 17 and 1800s, we see that narration style quite a bit. It wasn't exclusive, but we see it quite a bit. Nowadays, we're going to see more first person. That's not always true, right? The third person omniscient narrator is still with us. We still see it pretty regularly, but a lot of more modern literature will often take a more sort of direct, personal sort of perspective, and will sort of assume that kind of perspective. So we'll see more first-person narrators, and we'll see an example of that as we go here today. And just, the setting, I think I've already explained the setting in terms of both where we are physically. We are in Anna's home, about to have a salon meeting, but also in terms of time period, early 1800s during the Napoleonic Wars. Just remember to always keep both levels of setting in mind. Okay, so that's enough for War and Peace, just to give you a taste of what a longer sort of classic novel would read like, feel like, and look like. Now let's move on to the 20th century, and let's get back to the U.S. with Ernest Hemingway, who's one of our most famous writers, probably. You don't have to like him, maybe you haven't read him before, but A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is often held up as kind of just almost like a perfect short story. Not everybody agrees, but if we're just thinking about sort of the technical aspects of a short story, and if we're thinking about precision and efficiency, like sort of getting a lot done in a relatively small space of time, this is a great story to study. Hemingway is known for sort of his distinctive writing style, and a lot of scholars and literary historians today will argue that Hemingway really helped to kind of, he wasn't alone in this, but other writers of his generation, they really helped to kind of change a lot of writing styles in the U.S. by sort of simplifying. Hemingway's kind of famous for his short, terse sentences. He doesn't always provide a ton of description or explanation. He's known for being very interested in ideas surrounding masculinity and isolation and alienation from society. Not everybody's interested in his themes, but even if we don't really think he's got a lot of great ideas, most people will agree that his style was very innovative for the time. And along with some other writers of his time, they were able to kind of push prose fiction a little bit forward, kind of help to modernize it. make it, frankly, a little bit easier to read. Again, you might notice this difference if you compare Tolstoy to Hemingway side by side. Now, obviously, with War and Peace, we're reading a translation. It was originally written in Russian, of course. But just notice, if you've ever read anything from the 1800s, you'll notice that the language was often very flowery, a lot of words, a lot of adjectives, long sentences. And then when we get up to Hemingway, he's writing in the 1920s, 1930s. This story we're looking at here is from 33. He continues to write all the way up until the 60s. And throughout his career, we see this kind of muscular, lean, very action-centric prose that's not as flowery. Again, shorter sentences, more efficiency. And a lot of this has to do with his background as a journalist. He worked as a war correspondent, worked for various papers in Europe, both before and during his fiction writing career. So he kind of brought that straight to the point, sort of no-nonsense journalistic style, particularly what was common in like war correspondence, where you might not always have a lot of time or safety to write really elaborate things. He brings that style over to fiction writing, and it makes a big impact. So, but again, he's known for being able to, like I said earlier, to do a lot with a little, to make a big point, to deliver a lot of interesting themes in a relatively small space. And we see that here with a clean, well-lighted place. So there is a plot, although not a lot of momentous things happen here, but we do have a plot. It's late at night. We're in a cafe in Spain. Hemingway lived in Spain for a while, traveled widely throughout Europe, spent time in France and Spain, and wrote a lot about those places. So we're in Spain, we're inside a cafe, and we have an old man sitting alone drinking brandy. And there's two waiters who are working on this particular night, and we'll learn a little bit more about these three characters as we read on. They're serving the old man, and they're kind of waiting for him to hurry up and leave, because then they can go home for the night as well. So we begin to follow a conversation between the two waiters as they sort of comment on the old man, and they have very different opinions about the old man. We don't hear much from the old man. He's mostly silent, sitting there, drinking alone. But we learn a lot about him largely through the conversation that we hear between the two waiters. So again, we're noticing something already, a common thread here, which is dialogue. We get some dialogue in the first chapter of War and Peace. We actually hear characters, talking, and we hear that again in Hemingway. We hear the two waiters talking to one another. So that's dialogue. That's going to be very common. We'll see a lot of dialogue in fiction. But what's interesting about this story is when it first starts out, we're not really sure who the main character is. We meet the two waiters, we meet the old man, but as the story progresses, we realize that we're really kind of sticking with the older waiter. So we don't learn their names, but there's an older waiter and a younger waiter, and they have different personalities. They have different outlooks on things. They have obviously different opinions about the old man. And once they leave the cafe, we actually follow the old man as he goes to a bar on his way home. So we follow the older waiter, and we sort of get inside his head a little bit, and we learn more about his thoughts and his feelings. So the older waiter becomes the main character, not the younger waiter, not the old man. They're important characters as well, but our protagonist here, our main character throughout the story, is clearly going to be the older waiter. So those are the characters that we meet, but I just want you guys to notice that Hemingway is showing us a great example here of how to reveal character in different ways, right? So we can kind of go about revealing character in two different ways. I don't think I mentioned this last week. We can tell the readers about a character, and we can also show the reader about a character. So in terms of what the author is doing or what a narrator is doing in a particular work of fiction, those are the basic choices. A narrator or another character can just sort of talk about a character and describe that character for the benefit of the audience. So we are learning about that character by having information told to us. So the character can be revealed through telling. But then character can also be revealed through showing, and that's when the narrator might step aside. That's when other characters aren't necessarily telling us about the character in question. We're just sort of watching the character. We're observing the character do things. And we might hear the character talk, and through observing and hearing the character, we are learning about the character. So Hemingway uses both methods. When it comes to the old man, we largely learn about the old man by being told about the old man. The waiters tell us, right? Their conversation reveals a lot about the old man. But then when it comes to the older waiter, we're able to learn a lot about him by observing him. Right? Hemingway is showing us that character through the things that he says, the things that he does. So that's kind of different from the way that we learned about the old man drinking brandy. So just be aware of those two different methods of developing or revealing character. Now, in terms of point of view, okay, what is our perspective here? How is this story being told? What kind of narration do we have? Well, here we have a limited third-person narrator. So with Tolstoy, we saw an omniscient third-person narrator who kind of knows everything. But here we have a limited third-person narrator. So the narrator is not a character. The narrator is separate, from the story. He's not involved in the story. He's not one of these characters that we meet, in the cafe or later in the bar. So he is a third-person narrator, separate, outside of the action, but he doesn't seem quite omniscient. He's really only able to get us inside the heads of the older waiter, the main character, the protagonist. And this is often the case with limited third-person narration. With limited third-person narration, we'll get the main character's perspective. We'll get the main character's thoughts, the main character's innermost feelings, fears, hopes, dreams. But we don't usually get that level of access as readers. We don't get that same level with the other characters, right? With the other characters, we're just going to maybe hear their dialogue. We're going to observe certain things that they do, but we're not really going to get inside their heads. And I want you guys to notice as you're reading Hemingway, notice that we kind of get inside the older waiter's head, but we don't really do that with the younger waiter, and we don't do that with the old man drinking brandy. The limited third-person narrator can only give us full access to the protagonist, to the main character. With the other characters, we don't get as much. We don't know as much about them. But we do learn about them, but just we don't get as much access to info. And what we do learn about them is revealed through dialogue, a little bit more objective, a little bit more at a distance. Later in the story, we're kind of getting access to how the older waiter feels. It's a more intimate sort of relationship. We're getting access not just to what he's saying and not just his actions, but also kind of how he feels, like what he's thinking. It's almost like he's beginning to have a conversation inside his own head, kind of with himself, and we're getting access to that. So notice that in this short story, the narrator kind of disappears. Like early in the story, the narrator is there. The narrator is kind of setting the stage, describing these characters, letting us hear the conversation between the two waiters. But then as the story progresses, we kind of forget sometimes about the narrator. The narrator's not front and center, kind of making himself making his presence felt the way we might notice it in War and Peace, where the narrator is very present. The narrator is saying, oh, let me tell you about this person. Let me tell you about this person. Let me tell you about this. With Hemingway, the narrator kind of recedes into the background. We still have a narrator, and the narrator is still delivering information and narrating the story, but by the end of the story, it kind of feels like, again, we're sort of adopting the perspective of the protagonist. We're getting that sort of direct access to his thoughts, his feelings, his words, obviously, but we're almost kind of inside his head, and there seems to be really not much difference between the narrator's voice and the character's voice. This is kind of a convention or a strategy that a lot of novelists and short story writers use. You guys are going to see it in other places. Sometimes the third person narrator wants to get us really close to a character to the point where we're almost adopting the character's perspective. Maybe not for the whole story, but maybe for a scene, maybe for this moment. And the narrator's voice will sometimes even sound a little bit like the character's voice, or they'll just kind of blend together in a way where, you know, as readers, we might not be able to tell where one ends and the other begins. But in a lot of older literature, we're going to have these omniscient third-person narrators who are very visible and present. Like, they're not in the story, but they talk to us directly. And their voice is often going to sound different than the voices of the characters in the action. But Hemingway's doing something kind of more modern, something that we see a lot in literature today, which is that sort of limited third-person narrator who kind of recedes into the background and doesn't draw a whole lot of attention to themselves. So the focus is really more on the characters. And again, towards the end, like, we know that, like, we're kind of hearing the older waiter like talk and think, but we don't even get a lot of direct attribution. Like, he said, he thought. That's all attribution means. Often narrators give that to us. Sam said blank. Just that little part of Sam said, that's attribution provided by the narrator to sort of explain who's talking, who's thinking, who's doing what. But sometimes in modern literature, we don't always get attribution. Sometimes we get lines of dialogue or even thoughts of characters without always getting that he said, she thought. Because again, we're kind of blending the lines, we're kind of blurring the lines between the narrator and the character, and the narrator's almost getting us inside the head of the character, usually the protagonist. That's what a lot of modern limited third-person narrators do. So kind of interesting, very different really from what Tolstoy's doing, even though they're both using, in a very general sense, they're both using third-person narration. But we see how Tolstoy's omniscient narrator is a lot different than Hemingway's limited third-person narrator. And then finally, setting. I've already told you guys we're in Spain, probably Madrid. We don't know exactly the time period, but we can kind of assume, just because the author or the narrator doesn't tell us anything else, we can probably assume that we're in the time period in which this story was written. And this story was written in 1933. So we're probably around that time in Spain, first in the cafe, and then later we leave. But this is kind of a significant time period in the history of Spain because they fought a civil war, a very violent and bloody civil war between 1936 and 1939. So a little after the publication date of this story, but Hemingway himself later wrote about the Spanish Civil War. He reported on it. I think he was in Spain for part of that time. So that would be an event that would figure into later fiction written by him. But even if this story is set a few years prior, there was already some unrest and, some early signs that there might be trouble. So it always helps to have a little bit of cultural and historical context, just to kind of know when the story was written. That gives us an idea of when it's set. And sometimes authors will tell us, or they'll have their narrator tell us, we're going back in time, or this is set in the future. But often when they don't do that, And if there's no obvious markers like, oh, they're on horseback and they're in horse-drawn carriages, there's no cars yet, or, it's the Civil War or whatever, if they don't give us those cues, then we can just assume that we're in the contemporary period in which the text was written. So again, that would be the 1930s, 90 years ago. But Hemingway is a lot more modern, I think, than Tolstoy. And we can see some of those differences as fiction becomes more modern, as we leave the 1800s, move up through the 1900s, and start to get more of the stuff that we see today. All right, so let's move. Oh, and just one more thing, because I mentioned this last week. A lot of short stories typically get published in newspapers or magazines, other types of periodicals. I just mentioned that when we were talking about short stories last week, and this is a good example of that. So this short story was originally published in Scribner's magazine, which is a pretty popular American periodical that was published between like the 1880s and the 1930s. You might know that name. Scribner's is no longer a magazine. Now it's just a big publication house, a publishing company that puts out a lot of contemporary fiction. Like they've published a lot of famous novels and short story collections throughout the 20th century. But back in the old days, they were a sort of a monthly magazine, or maybe even a weekly magazine. I can't remember, but that's where this story first appeared. But of course, it's become very famous. It's in a ton of anthologies now, a lot of literature anthologies that people like me use at the college level. Okay, so let's move on now to our third selection, another short story by a famous American author, Catherine Ann Porter. And she just happens to be sort of a peer of Hemingway. Like they were roughly the same age. They were writing at the same time. So Hacienda, this story written by Porter, actually was published in 1932. And if you look at the link, so I've given you guys 2 PDFs this week and 2 links. So if you go to the link to the Porter story, you'll actually see where it was originally published. So I believe it was originally published back in the 30s in the Virginia Quarterly Review, which is a small periodical which still exists. And I think I'm linking you to their website where you can actually go back and find older issues of the magazine. But so again, a lot of short stories were first published in periodicals, and then later they would often be collected into larger collections like, 10 or 12 stories all written by the same author over a period of time. That collection would then be put out, and those would often be popular sellers as well. This is not just in the old days, right? This still happens. When we get to Nilda, we'll talk about it again. That was originally published in, I think, the New Yorker, the New Yorker, and then later it appeared in a collection of Diaz's stories that, like I said, I think came out in 2012. So that's still common for short stories to be published that way, even today. So if we look at Porter, we're looking at an example here of sort of a longer, more expansive short story, and she would actually later make this story even longer. It would almost become sort of a novella. A novella or a novelette occupies this kind of weird no man's land between a long short story and a short novel. So there's no official definitions of the novella, but something that's like around 80, 90, maybe 100 pages is sometimes considered too long to be a short story, but not quite long enough to be a novel. Some people just call it a short novel and call it a day. But yeah, she would later turn this into sort of a short novel, but here it's a true short story. But there's just more going on. Like compared to Hemingway, what we're seeing here is just kind of more stuff, more characters, a more well-developed kind of eventful plot. Everything's still pretty condensed, but a little bit more is going on. It can sometimes even feel perhaps a little chaotic, a little bit confusing, and that's kind of partly the point. But there's enough plot here, there's enough characters really to find a comfortable home in a full-length novel, or at least is in what she would later do, a short novel. So it feels different than the short story that we see from Hemingway because it's just kind of got a bigger scope overall. So to talk about the plot here, it might be a little hard to follow at times. Again, having a little background will help. So I'm trying to avoid spoilers here. So I'm just kind of getting you guys ready to read these on your own. And I don't want to talk too much about theme here because I want you guys to interpret the theme on your own. That's a big part of the literary analysis that we are learning to do in here. So it's always a good start to just wrestle with theme on your own. But I will give you a little bit of background here. So there's a movie being made. This is a story about a movie production. They are shooting a movie. Again, we're like in the 20s or 30s, the 1920s, 1930s, roughly the same time period that we're in with Hemingway. So, but we're in Mexico now. We're not in Spain. We're not in Russia. Now we're in Mexico, and we're on a large plantation, or sometimes called, we're on a plantation or a hacienda, which is just sort of this big property where they are growing crops, and there's usually a big house where the landowners live. So that's where we are in kind of rural Mexico, but we're on a pulque plantation. So pulque is an alcoholic drink made from the fermented sap of some particular plant that's native to Mexico. So that's what they're doing on the plantation, right? We have this rich family that owns the land, and they live there in the big house. And then there's like peasants basically who work the land, and they're the ones actually, harvesting the pulque. But a film crew has come to this place. They've come to this plantation, this hacienda, to film a movie. So the film industry is kind of young in the 1920s or 1930s. Movies kind of get invented like at the end of the 19th century, like the 1890s, really, in the form that we know them today. So it's still kind of early on, but they're already very popular. Movies take off very quickly. So this is right around the time that we transitioned from silent movies into sound movies. That transition occurred over the course of the 20s and 30s. So Porter actually worked for a brief time in Hollywood. So she's very interested in movie making, and she writes about it quite a bit in her fiction. So here we have a movie getting made on the hacienda, but the production gets delayed because of a tragedy that occurs while they're there. A young peasant named Justino accidentally shoots and kills his sister. So I'm not really giving anything away. That's revealed pretty early on. It's not really supposed to be a mystery. This is not a mystery piece of fiction. But that event is really the big complication or the conflict that gets introduced. So you remember we talked about last week with plot, how most plots have some kind of major conflict or complication that usually gets introduced during the rising action. So after the exposition, we get the rising action where we're kind of learning more about characters, things are happening, events are occurring, and usually the conflict gets introduced. Some kind of complication gets presented to the characters, and they're going to have to overcome this or fight this or deal with this in some way. And that's going to sort of be the spark for the rest of the action in the text. So even in a story like A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, where not a lot happens, the conflict there really involves the old man and how late he's making the waiters stay and the conversation that they have about it. But what you'll notice is that conflict, it sets in motion everything else that happens, and all the reflections, the thoughts, the feelings that the older waiter has after he leaves to go to a bar by himself for, a nightcap before he goes home to go to bed. So that old man gets him thinking. The conversation he has with the younger waiter gets him thinking about stuff, and that's kind of the catalyst for all the other action in this pretty short story where there's not a whole lot of action, but the action that we do see comes from that central conflict. But here in Hacienda, we get a more traditional kind of conflict, right? It's not something kind of mundane. This old man's, staying too long. We want to go home, or at least one person does, the other person's sympathetic. But here in the middle of this movie, or right before they can really get very far with their movie production, we have a death. We have a tragic accident. So that's a lot more of a big complication, and it will drive the rest of the action in the narrative. So we meet several characters here. We don't learn a ton about all of them, but we have a very interesting group. Some Americans, some are Mexican, some are Russian. So kind of sticking with our Russian theme this week, this is like a partly Russian film production, but there's some Americans involved too. So we have Kennerly, the American producer. He's kind of an ass. We learn a little bit about him largely through dialogue and through the narrator's observations. We also meet Spinsky, who's like the Russian director of the film. And then we meet Stepanov. He's like the main cameraman, also a Russian. I think the assistant cameraman is Andreev. And the narrator, I believe, knows Andreev. They have some kind of previous working relationship. The narrator here is interesting, though. Let's talk about point of view in a moment. We'll come back to her, the narrator. But we also have Don Gennaro. He's like the owner of the plantation. We meet his wife. We meet, I think, his father, or at least we hear about his grandfather. We at least learn about some of his extended family. We meet Betancourt, who's like the Mexican advisor to the Russians. And there's some other characters as well. Not all of them get developed very much. So, yeah, a much bigger cast here. A lot more people, a lot more voices. We learn about a lot of these different people. But our point of view here, again, is very interesting. So I messed this up last week. I was talking about how sometimes a character in the action will be telling us the story, but it's not the main character necessarily. It's not really the protagonist. It's like a minor character. It's somebody who's present, somebody who's in the story, but they're not our primary focus. So I accidentally labeled this as a type of third-person narration, but it's actually a type of first-person narration, but it's not the typical kind of first-person narration where we simply have the protagonist of the story telling the story from his or her perspective. This is kind of a weirder kind of first-person narration where it's a minor character providing the narration. So the character here is the writer, the screenwriter, who's been brought in to work on this movie, and she knows some of the people, but she doesn't take a leading role in a lot of the action that happens. The shooting, all the drama with Don Gennaro and like the local authorities and the Russians. She's just one of many, but we get her perspective. She's not necessarily presented here as like a typical protagonist or main character, although we might think of her that way, but she's not the central focus of the narrative. So in this way, she's like Nick in The Great Gatsby, Caraway, or Ishmael in Moby Dick. There are other famous examples of kind of minor characters who are in the action. They are in the narrative, but they're not the focus. But they're the ones telling the story. They're the ones serving as narrators. So that's what we get here. And she's not omniscient. She often kind of functions as a detached observer, a little bit like Hemingway's third-person narrator. She tells us things, but a lot of times she's kind of in the background, right? She's not necessarily taking on a huge active role, but she's revealing information. She's telling us about other characters, the history of this place, a little bit of the history of Mexico. But she's not omniscient, right? She's not godlike. She's a character in the story who knows a lot about the other characters, but she's not necessarily a classic protagonist, at least not in this form of the story. When she expands it, that might change a little bit, but here she just seems to be a member of this larger cast, but she's the one telling us the story, and for that reason, we might come to view her as a kind of protagonist, or as at least our sort of guide, the person who's leading us along and obviously telling us this story. And again, the setting here, we're probably in the 1920s, rural Mexico. This is kind of the beginning of the Hollywood golden age. So we get some references to the U.S. movie making industry, which is getting really big at around this time. But also, there's some famous Russian filmmakers during the 20s that were also pretty well known, even in the States back then. So we have this Russian influence, but also the Hollywood influence. There's a lot of international intrigue between these countries during this time period. Obviously, Russia had recently had a revolution. They had become first socialist, I guess, but then later communist. So they were kind of on our bad side. We, had sort of we were going to be on the same side again in the Second World War, just as we had been in the First World War. We had common enemies, but we weren't really allies. There was spying going on between the two countries. We weren't really friends. We didn't trust each other. We had very different economic and political systems, obviously. So that's all kind of part of the historical backdrop. But also, this is a period where movies are becoming more and more popular and kind of displacing maybe certain kinds of literature and older forms of media and entertainment, especially with the advent of the sound movies that happened in the late 1920s. Okay, so Hacienda, again, very different in terms of style, setting, subject matter, but we're seeing the same elements in all of these examples of fiction. And that brings us up to Nilda, a short story by Junot Diaz. Like I said, this came out in a collection by Diaz called This Is How You Lose Her, a collection of his short stories that was published in 2012. So, not even a decade old. If this other stuff strikes you as really old, Diaz might be a breath of fresh air. He is a lot different in terms of his style, his language, the strategies that he uses, and the ways that he uses these same elements. So Diaz might feel contemporary and modern, and he might speak to us a little bit more than these older writers. So This Is How You Lose Her is a collection of 9 sort of interconnected short stories, many of them featuring the same characters, featuring the same main character and first-person narrator, Junior, who we meet in this text, and we see him kind of growing up and doing a lot of different things throughout the collection. So they're all kind of related, but they're all standalone stories as well. And Nilda is one of those stories that appeared in the collection, but it was first published in the New Yorker before that collection ever came out. So again, we still see short stories published in that way. So it doesn't take long. It doesn't take you very long to realize that we're dealing with a very different work of literature here. So just a quick disclaimer, if you haven't taken a look at Nilda yet, I will warn you guys, there's a lot of profanity in the text. I know most of us don't probably have a problem with it, but if you do, or if you object to some of the other language that's used, there is some sexual innuendo, and there's definitely some offensive and objectionable language used by the characters, and Diaz does that very deliberately. It's not like an accident. But if any of that stuff offends you or makes you uncomfortable, by all means, you don't have to read it. Just read the other stories, and you can skip Nilda if any of that stuff just does not agree with you for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, Diaz writes in what we would call more colloquial English. So a couple of things to realize about this text, about the setting and the characters and the point of view, all very different from what we've been seeing previously. So we have a first-person narrator here who is Junior, and he's a member of sort of a Dominican immigrant community in New Jersey. So in case you're a little unclear on the geography, so I don't think Diaz ever actually says New Jersey. He might mention New York City once or twice, I can't remember, but we are in sort of the larger metro New York City area. But we're sort of in like north or like north central New Jersey here. And that's our setting. That's our geographical setting. And this very much mirrors, and Junior himself is kind of a approximation or a version of young Diaz. Diaz himself, he was born in the Dominican Republic, but he moved as a kid to New Jersey back in the 1970s, and he actually grew up in Parlin, New Jersey. And I've never been there, but it's pretty close to New York City. And he famously writes about growing up near one of the biggest landfills in the entire state of New Jersey. And if you guys know anything about New Jersey or just that part of the country, there are a lot of landfills. There's a lot of sort of industrial waste up there in that sort of northeast corridor near New York. So that's where we are. And we meet a lot of other members of this sort of larger, largely Hispanic community. And that's where Diaz sets a lot of his fiction. So I know we're not getting into all of this, but the character of Junior, he grows and develops over time. We meet him here as like a kid, high schooler, pretty young, but later he goes off to college and he sort of leaves his familiar neighborhood and starts to meet other kinds of people, and that's where a lot of the drama and conflict develop and future stories when he goes off to college. I think he goes to Rutgers, which is the big state university in New Jersey, but very different atmosphere, different milieu, and he, his life changes in various ways. But here he's pretty young. He's our main character. So we get a first-person narration style here. And obviously, the voice is very different from Hemingway's narrator or the first-person narrator that we see in Porter or the omniscient third-person narrator in Tolstoy. I mean, a lot of it's just time period, right? We've moved up at least to the late 20th century. A lot of this stuff is happening kind of like in the 90s. That's when Diaz sets a lot of his fiction. The 80s, the 90s. That's kind of where we are in terms of time period. So we have a lot of slang being used by our first-person narrator. And again, he uses a lot of language that a lot of us would probably not use in casual conversation or in polite company. But you guys might want to do a little bit of Googling or just kind of look around. If you don't know a whole lot about sort of, Dominican culture or Dominican immigrant groups, in the Northeast, there's a large Dominican population in New York City, a large population in a lot of Northeastern cities. Like in New England, Pennsylvania, but also obviously in New Jersey. So again, Diaz is kind of expecting us to know a little bit about this culture, and it's okay if you don't. I mean, if you grow up on the opposite side of the country, obviously it's okay if you don't know that much, but you can learn a lot just with a couple of Google searches. Look up some of the words that you don't recognize. Diaz will sprinkle in some Spanish throughout the text, but you might notice that a lot of the Spanish terms have sort of derogatory or in some cases offensive meanings. But one thing that our narrator Junior is kind of concerned about, one thing that he cares about, and it might make us feel a little uncomfortable at times, but it matters to him and it matters within this culture that he inhabits, is skin color. He talks a lot about his own skin color and his own appearance and how he has a relatively dark complexion. Meanwhile, his older brother, Rafa, who's a really good-looking, athletic guy, he has a lighter complexion. And this isn't just a throwaway detail that Diaz is giving us so we can kind of better envision what these guys look like. This matters, right? Skin color matters. And the brothers kind of make fun of each other, throughout the text at various times because of their different skin colors. So again, that's going to seem a little offensive to us. But we should remember that, they kind of have their own, values and standards within their own sort of immigrant culture. And it is kind of true. I mean, anthropologists have written about it. It's kind of a fact that skin color, not just in the Dominican Republic, but in a lot of Caribbean countries that were formerly Spanish colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, there are certain values or meanings attached to skin color, and that stuff matters. Maybe a little less today. Maybe people are trying to get past it. I'm not an expert, but that stuff that kind of matters in the text. It matters for these characters. And Junior kind of lacks self-confidence, right? Like his brother is very popular with girls, and obviously Nilda is Rafa's girlfriend. And Junior is constantly drawing a distinction. He's comparing himself to his brother. And he often finds himself to be lacking, but he does better in school, right? Like he's smarter. His brother is kind of cooler and is kind of more popular, but Junior is the one who ends up getting out of there. They kind of live in an economically disadvantaged area, not a lot of economic chances for these guys. Again, they live near these big landfills. It's not exactly primo real estate, even though they are close to New York. So again, some of these areas have probably changed a lot since Diaz grew up there. Now a lot of them might be bedroom communities for a very gentrified New York, but that wasn't really the case so much in the 80s and 90s in our setting. So again, our narrator here gives us a more personal, intimate style of narration where we're getting a little bit closer, right? There's nothing detached or separate about this narration because the narration is provided by the main character, the protagonist, and he's in the middle of a lot that's going on. Even when it might be intimate stuff between his brother and Nilda, he's still painfully close. So he gives us a much closer perspective, but also his voice, right? It's a colloquial voice. He's using kind of common, everyday American speech and slang, but also, peppering in some of these aspects of that immigrant Dominican culture that's kind of unique to, that part of the country, their particular area. I mean, you can find Dominican immigrants and Caribbean immigrants all over throughout the U.S. But again, that northeastern corridor has some of the largest concentrations. But we learn a lot about this community. And Diaz, I think, is very skilled about just dropping in place names, and he'll mention other immigrants, like where other people have come from, their countries of origin. So we realize what a diverse place this is. It's not just Dominicans, There's also people from Guyana, which is a country on the north coast of South America. There's people from Trinidad, which is a Caribbean island, So there's a lot of different kinds of immigrants living in this area, a lot of them from the greater sort of Caribbean area, but not even all of them speak Spanish. Like I think in Trinidad, that was an English colony, so I think they speak English in Trinidad and Tobago. Guyana also, I think, was British. I honestly don't know, but this is a very diverse sort of immigrant community, and Dominicans make up a big part of that, but not the only part. So he drops little references about that. He also mentions a lot of place names. Again, we're probably not familiar with these, but he mentions, South Amboy. He mentions Brick City at one point. That's a nickname for Newark, New Jersey, which is a pretty big city in that area. Malnalapan is another town in New Jersey that he mentions. These are all located pretty close together, and it's pretty close to where Diaz himself grew up and attended high school. So he's familiar with this particular geographical area, and he wants to really put us there. He doesn't explain a lot. Like, oh, this is the part of New Jersey we're in. This is how far from New York City we are. Again, he's kind of expecting some of his readers to either know where these places are or, to Google them and find out in a matter of seconds. So you guys should do that as well. If we're thinking about the plot, I want you guys to notice how this plot gets sort of revealed. Very different, really, than the plots of the other stories. So a lot happens here, right? There's clearly a plot. There's a lot of events. But I want you to notice that Junior just kind of tells us a lot of what happens, right? Like we do have a couple of well-defined scenes that we can talk about. But largely, Junior just kind of tells us things. He tells us things that happen to Nilda. We sort of watch her progression as things kind of deteriorate for her as she gets older, after her relationship with Rafa kind of goes sour. We learn about Rafa, and again, this is a recurring sort of feature in a lot of Diaz's stories. Rafa, the older brother, gets leukemia. So you guys might have been a little bit unclear about why he's getting sick, or like in the story, like why is he getting more and more tired? Like early on, we hear that he's a boxer, he's got muscles, he's really active, he goes on long runs, but then later he gets sick. And that's not fully explained in this particular story. But if you read the whole arc, if you read the whole collection, you'll see more clearly that Rafa gets leukemia and dies. I mean, again, I'm not sorry if that's a spoiler, but that's what happens. So that's a big source of trauma that Junior has to deal with as he grows up. So we learn about Rafa, we learn about Nilda, but we learn largely through Junior, right? I mean, we do get some scenes where we hear those other characters talk and we can observe them, but largely Junior provides a lot of explanation, a lot of exposition, and he just kind of delivers that to us throughout much of the story. But we do get a couple of well-developed scenes, like at the pool. And then later at the end of the story, at the laundromat, at the mini mall on Ernston Road. So again, look at how specific he gets with location and these aspects of setting. Just to really kind of make us feel like we're there and we're living in these characters' shoes for a minute, right? Junior's doing laundry and he runs into Nilda. And things haven't been going that well for her. So that scene is very well developed and well described, and it's very distinctive. We know where we are, and everything's happening kind of, we're kind of watching the action unfold, even though it's all past tense. It all happened in the past, right? Junior's telling us this from some future perspective, looking back on these previous events that happened when he was younger. But at least in that scene, things are kind of like we're in the action. We're watching it unfold. Whereas in a lot of other parts of the story, Junior is just telling us, yeah, and then my brother did this, and then Nilda did that, and I heard that Nilda got beat up, or she ended up with this guy, treated her badly. He just kind of tells us a lot. There is a lot of telling, but then in those couple of scenes, we also see showing. We also get shown stuff through how the characters interact, what they do, obviously their dialogue, and Diaz's description. So again, Diaz's voice really does sound a lot like Junior. He uses Junior as his narrator, but some people kind of think of Junior as kind of being a stand-in for Diaz, kind of a version of the real Diaz, and he's the life that Junior leads in these works of fiction is very similar to the life of Diaz. So yeah, if you guys want to Google him, look into him, he's very much he remains a popular author. There was some controversy about him sort of surrounding the Me Too movement. He definitely engaged in some behavior that not everybody was very fond of. He's still kind of retained his position in the publishing world. He teaches at, I want to say MIT, maybe, and he continues to publish. But when I was a graduate student back at the University of South Carolina, before I came out here to work, Diaz actually visited our school. I was unable to attend the reading. I can't remember. It must have been important, I guess. I couldn't go. But a lot of people were excited to have him there, and a lot of people were big fans, and some people boycotted it and did not want anything to do with him. He has a little bit of a reputation for being a little bit of a mean guy like in the real world, but his fiction has really resonated with a lot of people who can share that kind of immigrant experience that he often writes about, but also he's tapping into really universal themes about relationships, family, and how your life changes over time. So if you like Nilda, you might want to read some more Diaz, because again, Junior shows up in a lot of other short stories, and even some of his novels as well. So I hope you guys enjoy these examples. Again, I'm going to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit more about theme and interpret some of these stories in this week's discussion post. So hopefully you'll enjoy at least some of these. You'll have some good ideas, and I look forward to reading your posts. And I will see you next week as we get started on poetry.